Good morning. Welcome to this Monday morning, October 10th. This is for Sunday, yesterday, October 9th, 2011, which is proper 23A. It's been another beautiful sunny day here in Wisconsin. I flipped the computer around so that you get the other view of my office, my messy desk behind me this time. But welcome this morning. Yesterday was a Sunday that centered around this idea of banquet. We get the great banquet from Isaiah 25. That God will prepare a feast for all people, and death will finally be swallowed, and tears will be wiped away. We get that same sense in Psalm 23. We get the 23rd Psalm. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of my enemies. Philippians 4, a continuation of Paul's saying, rejoice always. I pray for you in all things, Philippians 4. And then we get this really difficult parable from Matthew 22 that continues these really hard sayings that Jesus keeps directing at the temple leaders, the religious leaders of the time. And now he tells this parable of a man who throws a wedding banquet for his son, and the invited guests don't come for a number of different reasons. And so finally he sends his slaves again to remind them that the feast is ready, that the son and the celebration of the son is ready. The fatted calf and oxen are killed, and those invited guests kill the slaves and again insult the king, insult the father who wishes to throw the party. And so then Jesus, in particular in Matthew, this story shows up in the Gospel of Luke in a very simple form. Shows up also in a Gospel of Thomas, 64, an apocryphal gospel. But it's helpful to know what the story looks like in that place too, also in a very simple form. In Matthew, it takes a violent turn. The king gathers his armies, he kills the invited guests, and he burns their city. And then there is this odd little thing where he then tells his slaves to go out into the streets and invite anyone who will come, and so the wedding banquet is filled up with these newly invited guests, and the king wanders through the banquet hall into the wedding reception and sees this man not appropriately dressed in a wedding robe and throws him out in the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Yesterday was an exciting day. It was homecoming weekend here at the university. We had a number of 10 to 15 or so alumni. There was an alumni reunion here at the Ecumenical Religious Center for alumni of Lutheran Student Association, and so we had 10 or 15 additional folks, guests in worship, and so that was a lot of fun. It was good having them with us. The sermon was very simple in its outline. It was a single story. It was a brief history lesson, not for history itself necessarily, although I think that's helpful. And it was a single point. So let's get at it. The story was very open in the sermon. The driveway was perfect. The cement was perfect, without flaw. The cement was watery, poured, shaped, without mark, without flaw. The new driveway of this man was perfect. And so the man stood back with his hands across his chest, admiring his new driveway, the workmanship, the handiwork of these cement pourers. And so the cement workers gathered up and cleaned up and tidied up, and they left in their big truck. And the man stood outside admiring his new driveway for a number of minutes and then went into the house. But not very far into the house. He stayed so that he could look out the window, peek through the blinds to keep an eye on his driveway. And sure enough, it wasn't long into his watch, not long into his vigil, that some neighborhood kids came and bent down with stick in hand that they should, in this new wet cement, leave a lasting mark. And so the man came bursting out of his house, bursting through the door, screaming, yelling, waving his arms, scattering the children in all directions, making a lot of noise, making a lot of ruckus. And so, in fact, the commotion brought other neighbors out of their homes. And one of the neighbors looked at the man and said, wow, that was a bit of an overreaction. And another neighbor said, I'm actually quite surprised. I always thought you to be rather fond of children. And the man said, well, he could understand that maybe the noise was too much, but indeed he did like children. He loved children. He liked the idea of children. He liked children in the abstract. He just didn't care for kids in the concrete. And so that was where we began, and then moved of that silly little story to the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew, if you remember where Matthew begins his Gospel, we don't get the long Christmas version, a long Christmas story that we get in Luke. Matthew begins with a genealogy beginning in Abraham, and then gets to verse 18 of chapter 1. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother had been engaged to Joseph, before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Skip down to verse 23. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet Isaiah. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. I made the point that from the very beginning, chapter 1, Matthew sets up this story that Jesus is Emmanuel, that the Messiah is God with us, God with us now, here in this mess, in this place, in this creation, in this world, in our lives, in our existence. Here is a God who comes and is a God with us in Christ. And so the rest of the story for Matthew is to do that over and over again. One of our pastors, retired clergy, Pastor Gavin, on Wednesday morning said the Gospel of Matthew is like a dog that simply won't let go of something, shakes and shakes and shakes this thing. And the thing that Matthew won't let go is that since Jesus is Emmanuel, since Jesus is God with us, then the stuff of us has to change. We have to bear fruit. We have to live as followers of Christ, as disciples of Jesus in a different way, and it has to show up in this stuff that is life. The brief history lesson is that by the fact that Matthew adds these details of this king who comes and is enraged by the rejection of the invited guests, and that one line is that he gathers the armies and he kills the murderers and he sets their city on fire. In 70 A.D., Emperor Titus, one of the Roman emperors, led an army against Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been taken over by the Essenes and the Zealots of early Judaism, and had captured the city, the Jerusalem being a walled city. And so for 4 years, Titus and a number of generals, a number of Roman armies had tried to take the city back. And in fact, sending in a Josephus, a Jewish historian, twice to negotiate some kind of peace. But finally, in the year 70, Titus broke through the wall, and there was such a frenzy. I read just a touch, and you can Google it. I read just a touch of Josephus's eyewitness account to the slaughter, that there was a frenzy amongst the Roman soldiers. In fact, killing one another, getting through the wall, and killing anyone that came, that showed up in front of them, crawling over body after body after body. Josephus said, though this is thought to be a bit exaggerated, that 1,000,001 Jewish people were killed, and Jerusalem residents were killed in that slaughter in 70 A.D. And then that finally ends up in 73, if you've heard the story of Masada, the Jewish last encampment. But that Matthew has to incorporate in his story of who this Jesus is as God, Emmanuel, God with us, that the Matthew reader or the Matthew hearer originally would have known, obviously, the tragedy of this story. And in fact, James, the brother of Jesus, in the early Christian church was centered in the temple in Jerusalem. So that for the Jewish people as a whole, the Jewish faith moves from a temple religion to a Pharisaic, a Pharisee rabbi religion of faith, and that the Christian church then moves out of Jerusalem, obviously, because it is utterly destroyed. All that remains is the Western Wall. All that remains of that great temple, of that great people, of that great faith of that time is the one west wall and a few towers. They literally laid down the walls of Jerusalem, stone by stone by stone, the Romans did, so that anyone who came to that area would see this great city that once was, but in revolt was destroyed by the great army of Titus. And in fact, there was an arch dedicated to Titus, showing the Romans carrying out the menorah, the candlesticks, out of the temple in victory. And the temple was burned. And the only thing, Josephus paints the picture, the only thing that quenched the fire at all was the blood of the Jews, was the blood of the people of Jerusalem, women, men, children, harmless, innocent, some not fighting. But the only thing that quelled the fire at all was the blood of the Jews. That little piece of history, important, very important to what happened in the Christian faith, what happened in the Jewish faith from 70. But my simple point of that is that Matthew wants to shake like a dog and not let go. That if this Jesus is God with us, then that Jesus has to appear in these things. That Jesus has to be as God with us. That we, as disciples of Christ, we are the ones who have to make some kind of good space, some kind of good place to understand God in our lives. With the students last Wednesday, as we look forward to the Sunday, I had them think about what's one of the very best times of their life, very specifically, and to tell it to a friend, a neighbor in the pew next to them. What's one of the very best moments of your life? What if you had to say what was the very worst day of your life? What was it? So to tell those two stories, the very best day of my life, the very worst day of my life, now go back and look and say, where is God in that? Where am I going to make space for God in that? Because that's our task. If in fact that we believe that Jesus is Emmanuel, is this Messiah, who do you say that I am? Peter says, I say that you are Messiah. And then Jesus says the Messiah will come, be handed over, die, and rise again on the third day. This is God with us. This is the Christ who takes up a place in the midst of life, in the midst of death, in the midst of joy, in the midst of sadness, in the midst of smiles, in the midst of tears, and takes a place at the table with us. And where God is at the table, death cannot preside. And so Isaiah, we get this wonderful text from Isaiah. We get this really awful, difficult text from Matthew. As a final little note here, it was mentioned that Garrison Keillor on Lake Wobegon had the Lutheran pastor there in Lake Wobegon preaching on Matthew 22, and she found it difficult, Pastor Liz is her name, found it difficult to preach on it because the weather has been so nice. And so she did decide to go with it in this, tell this awful story that Jesus tells in Matthew 22. But she summarizes the sermon by saying sometimes life is just a bitch. I referred to that in the sermon, although I didn't use the punchline. Just because she can say it from her pulpit doesn't mean I would dare say it from my pulpit, but here I will. And there's some truth in that, but here's the greater truth. Here's the one simple point. In the necessary messiness that is life, there is also a necessity that God enters this life. There is this messy necessity that God is Emmanuel, Christ is Emmanuel, God with us, precisely in the messes of life, precisely in the unfinishedness of life, that Christ should come finally and finish it. And Matthew will not let us off the hook. Matthew, Lutheran or not, Matthew, whether we like to hear it or not, says because you are a follower of Christ, you are the one who needs to hear and see and find God in this day that is messy or otherwise, and to say it so, to bear fruit as being a follower of Christ. So good luck on that. It was a ton of fun this weekend, even in the midst of really a difficult passage. And God bless you, grace and peace in all things, and we'll see you next Monday.